we have been discussing about the practices of traditional and indigenous knowledge when it comes to environmental ethics. We have discussed about the Indian and the Western perspectives in our previous class. Continuing the discussion today further, we will be picking up some of the examples as epistemological application tools to show how our indigenous or traditional or the Bharatiya knowledge system can be intertwined with sacred space as applied environmental ethics. And to begin with, we will be talking about the Kamakhya Temple of Assam. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, about Kamakhya Temple and the Nilachal Hills of Assam, let us understand the sacred geography and the ecological protection first. Now, Kamakhya is not merely a temple, but a living landscape. Hills, rocks, water, fertility, and ritual integrated. The goddess is embodied in earth, not abstracted from it. So here the philosophical implication as to why I have chosen the Kamakhya temple as one of the examples is because here nature is not symbolic, it is ontologically sacred. And also the second part, it being about the fertility, blood and earth ethics. There's this mela or the fair called the Ambubachi fair, which marks the menstruation of the earth. Earth acknowledged as reproductive, vulnerable and cyclic. So there is suspension of agriculture reflects ecological rest. And this example of Kamakhya temple is taken for this ritual encodes and ethics of pause, paralleling modern ecological fallow periods. And last but not the least, the reason why the Kamakhya temple as an example or as an application for the Bharatiya knowledge system has been taken here is also to discuss about the threat of development to the corridor projects, where modern infrastructure projects does threaten to a certain extent the hill ecology, the sacred hydrology, the cultural memory. So the philosophical tension is where development becomes or is seen as linear progress, sacred ecology as cyclical continuity. Thus, the ethical question that we all should be raising at this point is, can development violate the Rita while claiming sustainability? Remember, there has been the Rita, the Dharma and Prakriti intertwined when we talk about the indigenous or the Indian knowledge system perspectives. Now, Kamakhya as the living environmental philosophy, Kamakhya exemplifies what Leopold's land ethic talks about landscape as moral subject. That's the first reason why Kamakhya has been taken as an application model here. Number two, Nace's ecological self. So Kamakhya is seen as the human earth continuity, the other reason why Kamakhya temple has been picked up as a living environmental philosophy. The third, the tailor's respect for life, where earth's fertility is honored, but it goes further, where ethics enforced through ritual, taboo and reverence. Now, traditional and sacred environmental ethics supply a cultural depth to modern theory. It offers emotionally compelling moral motivation. It protects ecosystems where laws often fail. Now, let us remember that Leopold gave us community, Nace gave us self, Taylor gives us a moral standing. But sacred traditions gives us belongingness, reverence and restraint, without which environmental ethics remain fragile. So the first thing first, why a sacred site, the Kamakhya centered restoration framework is needed. Now, conventional ecological restoration frameworks are largely technocratic, emphasizing that biodiversity metrics, ecosystem services, and infrastructural sustainability. While scientifically indispensable, such approaches often fail in culturally dense landscapes where ecological degradation is inseparable from spiritual meaning, ritual life, and collective memory. Here we will see how a Kamakhya-centered ecological restoration framework integrates environmental science with sacred ecology, Indian philosophical concepts, and community ethics. Now, what is it about the Kamakhya temple, or why a sacred site-centered restoration framework are we even discussing at this point? As discussed, Kamakhya is situated on the Nilachal hills of Assam, which represents a living convergence of fertility, earth, symbolism, ritual temporality, and sacred geography. Restoration here cannot be merely ecological. It must also be ontological, ethical, and cultural. Now, let us recollect that the philosophical foundations of framework is based on Rita. Rita as the ecological order and diagnostic principle. Rita, understood as cosmic and ecological order, serves as a diagnostic lens for restoration. Environmental degradation around the Nilachal Hills, soil erosion, hydrological disruption, deforestation, and infrastructural stress can be interpreted as symptoms of Rita Bhanga or disruption of order. Restorative implication, where ecological restoration becomes an act of realigning disturbed natural rhythms, not merely repairing damaged components. Number 2 was about dharma. Dharma as contextual restoration responsibility. Dharma provides a normative framework assigning situated ecological duties to different actors. The temple authorities are considered to be the custodians of sacred ecology. State agencies are trustees, not owners. Devotees and pilgrims are taken as ethical participants, not consumers. And local communities are considered as inheritors of ecological memory. So, restoration guided by dharma avoids universal templates and instead foregrounds a place-specific ethical responsibility. The third has been about Prakriti. Prakriti as living, self-regulating system. Viewing Nilachal Hills as Prakriti emphasizes its self-organizing capacity. Restoration must therefore prioritize regeneration over control, supporting natural succession, native species revival, and hydrological balance. So, Kamakhya is a model of sacred ecology. The first is about the ontological sacredness of the landscape. At Kamakhya, the goddess is not represented anthropomorphically but embodied in earth, stone, water, and fertility. This establishes an ontological claim. Harming the landscape constitutes harm to the sacred itself. This worldview provides a powerful ethical basis for ecological restoration that surpasses instrumental conservation arguments. Now, the Ambubachi fair or the Ambubachi Mela ritualizes the menstruation of the earth, during which cultivation and temple rituals pause. The culturally encoded ethics of rest aligns with ecological principles such as the fallow periods, the threshold limits, recovery cycles. Restoration must include plant, non-intervention zones and temporal pauses. Now, as a footnote, if it can be mentioned here, Ambubachi in the local tongue is pronounced as Ambubahi, and Bahi in the tongue of Assamese means anything which is outside or anything which is stale or anything which is impure. So Ambubachi is basically the fair of impure for goddess is menstruating, and it is a celebration of the menstrual blood. Now, the Kamakhya-centered restoration model, or the KCRM, the first point or the first pillar that we should be considering now as an application example is the sacred zone. The Nilachal landscapes should be organized into ethically differentiated zones. Number one is the core sacred zone, where no construction, strict ecological protection is maintained. Number two is the ritual buffer zone, where there is a low impact ritual activity. Third is the community interaction zone, where there is sustainable livelihoods, eco-education. Now, this mirrors both sacred grove logic and contemporary biosphere reserve models. Pillar number two is about the ritual informed temporal regulation. Ecological interventions should follow ritual calendars. Suspension of constructions during Ambubachi, monsoon-aligned restoration activities, seasonal limits on pilgrimage flow, time, not space, becomes an ethical regulator. Pillar 3 is the indigenous and local ecological knowledge. Local communities possesses generational wealth of knowledge of hill stability, native vegetation, sacred water channels. So this framework mandates co-production of knowledge, resisting expert-only restoration models. And pillar number 4, the ethical pilgrimage management. Pilgrimage is reframed as ecological participation. Waste-free ritual materials, devotional acts linked to restoration work, education on sacred ecology. Pilgrims become caretakers rather than ecological stressors. Pillar 5, governance as trusteeship. Drawing from Dharma and Leopold's land ethics, governance is conceived as trusteeship rather than ownership. Decision-making bodies must include temporal representatives, ecologists, local community elders, cultural scholars. Now, there are, however, certain ethical tensions and certain safeguards that can be suggested here. Number one is avoiding romanticism. The framework explicitly resists idealizing or idealizing traditions. That is, rituals are subjected to ecological evaluation, ensuring symbolic acts do not produce material harm. Number two, navigating development pressures. Infrastructural projects must pass a sacred ecological impact assessment, addressing disruption of sacred hydrology, visual intrusion on sacred topography, and violation of ritual rhythms. So, the Kamakhya-centered framework offers a transferable model for sacred rivers, hill temples, indigenous sacred landscapes. It bridges the gap between environmental ethics, ecological restorations, and cultural sustainability. So, a Kamakhya-centered ecological restoration framework demonstrates that sacred spaces are not obstacles to sustainability, but ethical resources for regenerative practice. By integrating Rita, Dharma, and Prakriti with contemporary restoration science, this model reimagines restoration as an act of care, restraint, and renewed belonging rather than technical repair alone. In doing so, it offers a compelling response to the ecological crisis of sacred landscapes in the Anthropocene. Now, at this juncture, we are good to see and discuss how a comparative environmental ethics of Indian philosophy and sacred space can be taken care of. Please understand that the contemporary environmental ethics has largely emerged with Western philosophical traditions responding to ecological crisis through concepts such as sustainability, stewardship, and rights of nature. While these frameworks are analytically rigorous, they often suffer from motivational thinness and cultural abstraction. Here, the traditional and religious environmental ethics, when read in dialogue with modern environmental philosophy and grounded in Indian philosophical categories, what is offered is a more robust, lived, and context-sensitive ethical framework. So, by integrating the thought of Aldo Leopold, Arne Naess, and Paul W. Taylor with Indian concepts such as Rita, Dharma, and Prakriti, and situating the analysis with the sacred landscape of Kamakhya Nilachal Hills, we are trying to demonstrate how environmental ethics can move from abstract normativity to embodied moral practice. Now, Leopold's land ethics has made a decisive shift in environmental philosophy by extending moral consideration to the entire biotic community. Leopold's assertion that humans are plain members and citizens of the land challenges anthropocentric ethics and resonates deeply with traditional sacred geographies. Now, sacred groves, pilgrimage landscapes, and ancestral lands across cultures function as moral communities, not unlike Leopold's biotic community. However, while Leopold relies on ecological understanding and ethical reasoning, traditional systems embedded these ethics within ritual prohibition and sacred obligation. So we see that the analytical rigor in Leopold's land ethics provides conceptual clarity, but traditional sacred systems provide ethical durability through effect, taboo, and reverence. Similarly, with Arne Naess's deep ecology, who has introduced the notion of the ecological self, arguing that environmental protection arises naturally when individuals identify with the wider ecological whole. This notion parallels the non-dual traditions in Indian philosophy and in indigenous cosmologies, where the boundary between self and nature is porous. Yet, deep ecology often remains philosophically abstract and difficult to operationalize socially. Traditional religious practices, by contrast, the ritualistic, non-dualistic, making metaphysical unity socially visible and ethically enforceable. So, the deep ecology philosophically articulates what sacred traditions culturally enact. Further, Taylor's biocentric ethics argues that lived beings and teleological centers of life deserving moral respect. This emphasizes on individual life forms, finds strong parallels in Jainism's doctrine of ahimsa and Buddhists' compassion. However, Taylor's framework struggles with ecosystem-level conflicts. Traditional Indian frameworks resolve this tension by situating individual moral worth within cosmic and ecological balance, rather than isolating organisms as competing moral units. Traditional ethics integrate individual moral considerably without fragmenting ecological wholes. Now, the Indian philosophical framework as environmental ethics with the Rita, if we remember, has been about the cosmic order as ecological principle. Rita is the foundational Vedic concept that refers to the cosmic order that sustains natural, moral, and social harmony. Environmental degradation with this framework is not merely material damage, but a violation of cosmic rhythm. So, rivers flowing, seasons cycling, and fertility renewing are expressions of Rita. Disrupting this process through unchecked extraction or development constitutes ethical disorder. So, ecological restoration becomes an act of moral and cosmic realignment. Similarly, dharma denotes the situated ethical duty rather than universal rule following. Environmental responsibility, therefore, varies according to role, place, and historical moment. This framework anticipates contemporary, what they call as the localized environmental governance, recognizing that ecological ethics cannot be detached from cultural and geographic specificity. Thus, dharma offers a flexible yet binding ethical model capable of responding to diverse ecological contexts. We also have Prakriti, where in Sankhya philosophy and the broader Indian philosophy, Prakriti is not inert or matter, but a dynamic, self-organizing force governed by internal balance or gunas. Human domination of nature is therefore metaphysically incoherent. Environmental ethicists within this framework emphasize harmonization rather than control, aligning closely with contemporary ecological science while relating to philosophical truth. And the example of the sacred space as an applied environmental ethics of the Kamakhya Nilachal Hills that we have taken is where the Kamakhya temple complex exemplifies sacred geography where hill, stones, water, fertility and the form a unified ecological spiritual system. The goddess is not symbolically represented but materially present in the landscape. This challenges modern separations between culture and nature, rendering environmental harm a form of sacrilege. And also, as discussed, the Ambubachi Mela does mark the menstruation of the earth, during which agricultural activities traditionally stops. This ritual encodes an ecological ethics of rest, renewal and respect for natural cycles. So the analytical parallel we see where the ritual mirrors modern sustainability principles of fallow periods and ecological thresholds, but is enforced through cultural reverence rather than regulation. Contemporary infrastructural projects around Nilachal Hill also at times possess serious ethical questions. Developments framed as linear progress conflicts with sacred temporalities grounded in cyclical community. From the standpoint of Rita and Dharma, such interventions risks disrupting not only ecosystems but cultural memory and moral order. So now then if we have to synthesize it and have to talk about a plural and embodied environmental ethics, we see that the comparative analysis reveals that with Leopold offers community, Nasus offers identity or ecological self, and Taylor offers moral standing, traditional and sacred frameworks provide belonging, restraint and reverence. These elements are essential for long-term viability of environmental ethics. Sacred spaces such as Kamakhya demonstrates that environmental ethics is most effective when it is lived, ritualized and culturally embedded. Thus, we see that here in this entire discussion, we have tried to argue that integrating modern environmental philosophy with Indian metaphysical frameworks and sacred geographies yield or give a richer, more actionable environmental ethics. Rather than romanticizing tradition, it calls for critical reinterpretation, recognizing sacred spaces as ethical resource capable of informing contemporary ecological restoration, environmental justice and sustainable development. Environmental ethics ultimately must recover not only new policies and technologies but new ways of belonging to the earth. So to sum up, we can say that environmental ethics can only be seen or studied or discussed when we understand the importance of belongingness, of restraint, of reverence, and number 2, when we see the sacred spaces as lived, ritualized, and culturally embedded. We must also keep in mind that in the name of development or the development of corridors, we should not in any way do such constructions that might harm the very ethos of those spaces, which is to do with the Rita as discussed, Dharma and Prakriti. For as long as there is Rita, there is Dharma and there is Prakriti, the interflow or the interconnectedness of sacred space as sacred continues. And Indian philosophical framework thus not only provides an ethically sound perspective which the Western philosophers like Arnes, Leopold and Taylor ought to take cognizance of, but we must remember that the cosmic order as ecological principle, where ecological restoration becomes an act of moral and cosmic realignment, or that of the dharmic principle, where dharma denotes the situated ethical theory rather than universal rule following, needs to be addressed. For dharma offers a flexible yet binding ethical model capable of responding to diverse ecological contexts. So, the entire discussion today has been the comparative and situated environmental ethics vis-a-vis the example of the Kamakhya temple of Nilachal Hills of Assam, where we have seen that the distinction between nature and culture or Sanskriti versus Prakriti gets blurred, and both becomes a continuity of the other. So, the Western lens or the Western prisming, as much as it is ecologically sound and analytical rigor is there, but the Indian knowledge or the Indian wisdom cannot be denied. Thus, the Kamakhya centered ecological restoration or the sacred ecology in practice shows to us time and again that the conventional ecological restorations are largely technocratic, emphasizing biodiversity metrics, but they are also lived experiences. And as much as we consider this phenomenologically by bringing in a renewed hermeneutics methodology, we will not really understand the application part of a Kamakhya-centered ecological restoration framework that integrates environmental science with sacred ecology, Indian philosophical concepts, and community ethics. So, this was all about our sacred site centered restoration framework today, where we have picked up about the example of Kamakhya as the application model. We will be discussing more such models from India and around in our next lecture. Hopefully, the lecture has been clear, and we discuss more about lived experiences of sacred spaces vis-a-vis environmental sustainability henceforth. Thank you so much.